This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. This is part 3 of the discussion of John Salza's errors on Sedevacantism, refuting his article that attacked the Sedevacantist position. In the last part, we left off speaking about how John Salza's primary distinction between the fact that heretics lose their offices without any declaration, and number 2, that a declaration is supposedly required for Catholics to identify who is a heretic, is completely refuted by the teaching of Pope Paul IV, St. Robert Bellarmine, who is simply explaining what the Church has always taught, and also by the 1917 Code of Canon Law, because it quotes Pope Paul IV's bull while repeating the core principle that heretics lose offices without any declaration. Nevertheless, Salza's article asserts repeatedly that the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and that's primarily what he relies on, teaches that a declaration is required for a Catholic to recognize a heretic. So now I want to look at the canons he brings up and show how he has misused and distorted them completely. He cites canons 1557 and 1558 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and he says, quote, "First, the 1917 Code says that the Pope is the sole judge of the cardinals. Canon 1557, paragraph 1-2 says, quote, "It belongs entirely to the Roman Pontiff to judge cardinal fathers, cardinal priests," end quote. Moreover, Canon 1558 says, quote, "In the causes of which Canon 1556, 1557 treat, the incompetence of any other judge is absolute," end quote. In other words, only the Pope and no one else can judge a cardinal in doctrinal or disciplinary matters. The Pope's authority is absolute in this regard. Unlike the Pope, who has no judge, the cardinals do have a judge, and it is the Pope alone. Therefore, the Pope alone determines if a cardinal, prior to his elevation as Roman Pontiff, has deviated from the Catholic faith or fallen into some heresy. End quote from Salza. So that's the argument he makes, and as I said in my article, this is the type of argument that is superficially persuasive, but in fact completely wrong. Here's why his argument proves nothing. It's because these canons pertain to trials. They have no relevance to the issue. The principle that a heretic loses his office without declaration means without a trial. Without declaration means without a trial. These canons deal with the procedures and processes for conducting trials and are therefore completely irrelevant. In fact, they come within a section called, quote, "on trials in general." Canons 1557 and 1558, which he brings up and quotes, simply legislate that a pope alone has the right to preside over the trial of a cardinal or designate the judge at a trial. Certainly that's true, and completely irrelevant, because we're talking about things that take effect without any declaration or trial. The Code itself teaches in Canon 188.4, as we already discussed, that the publicly heretical cleric loses his office without any trial or declaration. As Pope Paul IV said, as we already quoted, that this takes effect and the heretic can be recognized, quote, "without need of any further declaration," in other words, without a trial. As Bellarmine said, he can be rejected, quote, "which means before any excommunication or judicial sentence," in other words, before any trial. So the argument is specious and proves nothing except his own incompetence or malice and his ability to distort canon law. Let's move on to his next misapplication of canon law. It's Canon 1939, and he makes a similar mistake. It's a similar type of argument. He cites this canon and says, quote, "The 1917 Code of Canon Law imposes other requirements that Sedevacantists ignore. For example, Canon 1939, paragraph 1 requires a special investigation for certain transgressions against divine law, for example, heresy, if the transgression is not notorious or not entirely certain, but has arisen from rumor or public report. Before anyone is summoned to answer for the transgression, a special investigation must be undertaken to decide whether and or what foundation the charge may be founded." End quote from Salza. Once again, completely irrelevant. If you look at the context of this canon, you will discover that it comes in section 2, quote, "on particular norms to be observed in certain types of trials, end quote. That means that it is irrelevant to this issue. It's a canon found in the context of other canons that deal with the procedures and processes to be followed in gathering information for and conducting trials. In fact, the subsection in which this canon is found is Title 19 on the criminal trial. That is irrelevant to the principle that publicly heretical clerics lose their offices without any trial. Obviously, the code is going to lay down procedures for how trials are to be conducted and how an investigation should occur in normal times. However, these procedures do not invalidate the principle that the code already taught in Canon 188.4 and was taught by Pope Paul IV and by Bellarmine, and flows from common sense and all of church tradition on the external unity of faith, that a clearly publicly heretical cleric loses his office and can be recognized without any trial. And this is especially true when we consider situations in which those who would be held responsible for investigating ecclesiastical crimes are themselves the ones who have publicly defected from the faith, rendering a normal investigation procedure impracticable. And that's why the Code and Pope Paul IV and the tradition of the Church teach that heretics can be recognized without any declaration. Because if you always had to wait for the declaration, then a Catholic would be at the mercy of the wolf. In fact, in his bull, Pope Paul IV says that he made this decree specifically to make it clear that Catholics could reject such a heretic, so that the, quote, abomination of desolation would not take root in the Church of God. In other words, he saw that if people followed this false principle promoted by Salza and similar deceivers, that you always must submit to the man who purports to be the Catholic authority, even if he completely rejects Catholic teaching and is spreading a new religion. They would be following him to their own damnation. And so, to free Catholics from such bondage, they explicate this principle, which is what the Church has always taught, that those who defect from the faith must be rejected, because you cannot have an external unity of faith with people who are denying Catholic teaching. And so the argument again is very deceptive, 100% irrelevant, and false. It deals with trials, and that's irrelevant. And to show the demonic stupidity behind these arguments, we just have to consider that according to Salza and his fellow heretics, Catholics, since they have to wait for a declaration, should profess communion with the Vatican II clergy, who themselves profess communion and in fact commemorate as a servant of Christ people like Ted Kennedy, who was in favor of, quote, gay marriage and abortion. According to the demonic stupidity of this argument, you have to profess communion with Benedict XVI, who just last week was in England mocking the English martyrs in a Protestant abbey with a pro-homosexual layperson posing as the Archbishop of Canterbury, head of an Anglican non-Catholic sect which rejects the papacy, rejects Marian dogmas. He gives a, quote, joint blessing with this notorious heretic and engages in condemned interfaith worship with him. This is just standard in the counter-church. This is totally incompatible with any kind of concept of historic Catholic teaching on heresy, on schism, etc. It's gone. If you listen to any discussion of these events by mainstream Vatican II figures, they do not regard the Protestants and the schismatics as heretics or schismatics. They can't, because Benedict XVI doesn't. And so what has been imbibed is a total repudiation of traditional Catholicism. Heresy is no longer heresy, schism is no longer schism, and this is the end result, the demonic result, of the teaching of heretics like Salza, who would have Catholics submit to a clear anti-pope, a heretical monster like Benedict XVI, and pervert Catholic teaching, which truly declares that you can recognize such obvious defectors from the faith as outside the Church. It's not a question if Benedict XVI believes in traditional Catholic teaching. He doesn't. It's a fact. So in the next part, I'm going to cover more, and you definitely want to stay tuned for when I get into his astounding and revealing contradictions. In the next part, I'm going to discuss his false claims about the heresies of the Vatican II anti-popes and why he thinks they are not public.